let's get started. We're here tonight for our third Thursday program for August, and we are talking about writing about Texas. And I'm really excited for this conversation. I think we're very lucky to have the writers here that we do, and it's going to be a great time. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce each of our writers, our panelists, and then I'll stop sharing this screen so you don't have to look at it anymore. So here we go. David Bowles is a Mexican-American author from South Texas, where he teaches at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He's written several award-winning titles, most notably The Smoking Mirror and They Call Me Güero. His work has also been published in multiple anthologies, plus venues such as the New York Times School Library Journal, Strange Horizons, English Journal, Rattle, Translation Review, and the Journal of Children's Literature. In 2017, David was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. And there's so much more that we could say. And I'm actually going to ask you about some of the other things that are on your resume later tonight. But thank you so much for being here, David.
Happy
Give it up in the chat box, guys. This is your opportunity to fake clap. All right. Michael Hall graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 1979 with a degree in government. He wrote for various publications, including Trouser Press, Third Coast Magazine, the Austin American Statesman, and the Austin Chronicle. In 1997, he joined Texas Monthly, where he has won 2 Texas Gavel Awards from the State Bar of Texas and 4 Stephen Philbin Awards from the Dallas Bar Association. He was named the CRMA's Writer of the Year in 2015, and his stories have appeared in the Best American Magazine Writing, the Best American Sports Writing, the Best American Non-Required Reading, Da Capo Best Music Writing, the New York Times, and Men's Journal. He's also a musician and has played in Austin bands The Wild Seeds, The Setters, The Lollygaggers, and The Savage Trip. Please welcome Michael Hall.
Sure.
You're still a little dim there, Michael.
This is actually turn on a light. Is that a little better?
Yeah.
There you go.
It brings you into the light a little.
Thanks.
Mary Helen Specht's first novel, Migratory Animals, was an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review and the Austin American Statesman, an Indie Next pick, and an Apple iBook selection. Migratory Animals also won the Texas Institute of Letters Best First Fiction Award and the Writers League of Texas Work of Best Fiction. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Colorado Review, Prairie Schooner, Michigan Quarterly Review, the Southwest Review, Florida Review, Southwestern American Literature, World Literature Today, Blue Mesa, Hunger Mountain, Book Slut, the Texas Observer, and Night Train, where she won the Richard Yates Short Story Award. A past Fulbright Scholar to Nigeria and Dobie Paisano Writing Fellow, Specht currently teaches creative writing at St. Edward's University in Austin, and Texas Monthly has named her one of 10 writers to watch. Please welcome Mary Helen Specht. All right,
Thank you for having me.
Let's get rid of that screen. So, writing about Texas, small topic, I know, but we're gonna cover it, guys. So I wanted to start, if you'll indulge me, and I wanna say this for the attendees as well, both who are in the Zoom that we're hosting and also who are out there on the live stream. I'm just wondering, when I think about Texas, so many different phrases, words, adjectives come into mind. So I'm gonna ask each of you, our panelists, and anyone out there, to just come up with 3 words that you would use right now to describe Texas. If you were trying to not sum up the state, I'm not trying to trick you or make this harder than it needs to be, but 3 words to describe Texas. And if anyone else out there wants to put something in the chat box, you're welcome to as well. What do you got? I'm looking at you, Mary Helen Specht.
Sorry, you mean to describe just Texas, not Texas literature, but like just Texas?
Texas. I mean Texas.
Okay, I would say maybe misunderstood. I would say obviously diverse in like many, many different ways. That's what would come to my mind first.
All right, we've got misunderstood, we've got diverse, we've got big, large, and huge in the chat box.
Big, large, and huge.
David, how about you?
I would say the words that pop into my mind are like Tex-Mex, red with blue blotches. Adjectives that pop into my mind for Texas, not very many. I just think of like noun phrases. Yeah, I totally agree that it's misunderstood. It's a lot more diverse. It's I think linguistically diverse, and older. I think than people. Oh, everybody is getting an Amber Alert at the same time. Live. I love it.
I hope everything's fine. Yes.
Yeah, hopefully so. So yeah, definitely linguistically diverse in ways and old, ancient.
Old, yeah. Mike Hall, what about you?
All right, I'm just gonna say the three things that sell the most magazines at Texas Monthly, which is Willie Nelson, barbecue, and cowboys. So I mean, those are kind of like the obvious things, but you know,
Right.
I mean, yeah, Texas is so big, it's really almost impossible. I mean, Texas should be 5 or 6 different states.
Agreed.
So you know, you could go off into each region and come up with your own description.
So some of the things we have in the chat box: home, blue bonnets, big skies, hot, vast, beautiful, hot, mythic, mysterious, heat.
I'm sorry, Whataburger. Whataburger is the only one that matters in that list.
Whataburger, friendly, and Texas, unlimited possibilities everywhere. Cattle, oil, cotton. Okay. So, and I think you're absolutely right. Of course, there's so much you could say. There's no limit to sort of the descriptives that you could use. And especially because the state is so vast and has so many diverse landscapes and people and cultures and everything you can imagine. So what I want to start with really is asking each of you, and David, I'm going to start with you. What does it mean to be a Texas writer? And would you consider yourself a Texas writer?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely did consider myself a Texas writer. And I think, I mean, beyond the obvious, you know, being from Texas, I think that, you know, being concerned about the historical things that Texas represents, which is this interesting blend of rugged individualism and community, this notion of independence, and this may sound like a repetition of what I said, but like independence, but independence not as an individual trying to break away from our larger group, but of communities wanting to find ways to protect themselves and be the best they can be. The kinds of things that I think about when I think about writing that's centered in Texas, you know, has to do with that. It has to do with pushing back against what maybe other states are doing in the nation, or what other regions in our country. I mean, we're not quite South, we're not quite Southwest. We're something like wholly unique and yes, really big and with our own divisions, but there's a character, kind of a homey character, kind of a rural character that is surprisingly sophisticated once you get past that gloss of kind of, whether it's working class Mexican American or rural, you know, white ranch hand or whatever it happens to be. You know, once you get past that superficial notion that people have about what Texas identity is, there's a quiet sophistication underneath it. And I think that a lot of our literature has that as well, that, you know, a lot of people from outside of the state of Texas might be slightly dismissive of literature that comes from a state that is, you know, widely misunderstood and seen as being, you know, backwards or whatever. But I think our literature has, you know, a homespun sophistication that is maybe not unique, but certainly that kind of notion informs the work that I do.
Yeah, I love that, homespun sophistication. Mike Hall, what about you? Are you a Texas writer, and what does it mean to be a Texas writer?
I'm not from here. My dad was in the Army, so we grew up all over. And I didn't get here until I went to college, or high school and then college. And it took me a while to really kind of get it, you know, because I lived in Austin. I didn't really go out into the world much. And then my friends and I started to actually go out and literally journey out to small towns and spend time out in these towns. And it was like for the first time I started to see Texas for what it was, these small towns that were conservative here and, you know, run down here and had money here. And when I got the job at Texas Monthly, I mean, which was quite a while now ago, I started going out and venturing out to actually see what Texas really was. And, you know, that was like the first time where I really started to fall in love with the state and with all of its paradoxes, with the racism in East Texas, with the crazy cowboy culture, which is not always so pretty out in West Texas, you know, with, you know, there was so much to the state that I didn't like, but there was so much that I loved from tradition and from this reverence for the old way to the fact that you go to Houston and it's like going into a reflection of the entire world with all the different communities that are there. And so, I mean, to me, Texas is changing so much. This is one of the challenges for me as a journalist is, what is the new Texas? You know, what is Texas as it's changing? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I do consider myself a Texas writer, even though I don't have it in my blood, just by the sheer fact that I've learned to love it. I've learned to fall in love with it, both the good and the bad. And that I feel like it's really important to try and convey that. Yes, I'm definitely a Texas writer.
All right. Mary Helen, what about you?
I don't think I could deny that I am a Texas writer. Although I will say that, you know, I think Larry McMurtry at some point said in one of his books about how he had to read himself out of Texas before as an adult, he read himself back in. And I feel kind of similarly in that sense of growing up. I grew up in Abilene and kind of the boring, flat, ugly part of West Texas. And I just, you know, could not wait to leave. I thought I was, you know, way different than the people around me. And so I certainly, it's only kind of as an adult that I've kind of come to terms with being a Texas writer. And I don't think I really even started writing about Texas until I lived in Boston for graduate school. And I was writing a bunch of short stories at that time, and I was putting together my thesis, and I was trying to see where the common threads are. And I was like, wait, all of these stories in some way are about Texas, and I hadn't even realized I was doing it. And then, you know, I spent a number of years not living in the state, but it's kind of like The Godfather, you know, you try to get out and they suck you back in. And so I ended up back here living and teaching, and my first novel also ended up being mostly set in Texas. And so it seems like despite my best efforts, I am a Texas writer.
I love that, despite your best efforts.
Despite my best efforts, I have ended up as a Texas writer. And, you know, sometimes I'm on these kind of panels or, you know, for awards or fellowships where we're trying to discuss, you know, what book or writer we're going to give an award to. And there's always this discussion of, well, is this person really a Texas writer if they weren't born here, or if they don't live here anymore, or if the book is not set in Texas, but they are from Texas. And for me, I'm always the one kind of arguing that I don't think any of those kind of strict definitions matter. I feel like if you as a person, as a writer, are grappling with some aspect of what it means to live in Texas, to be, you know, part of a community in Texas, I think that to me, and you know, you consider yourself that, to me, that's what all you need to be a Texas writer.
Well, and you know, you wrote a wonderful piece for Texas Highways about going to the dance hall in Big Spring with your parents, and talking a little bit about your childhood and sort of growing up in Abilene. And so for all of the like, couldn't wait to get out as soon as you could, there's a lot of love there that you feel for that part of Texas and for your roots there. Right.
Absolutely. Of course. Yeah. It took some time to get to that point, but absolutely.
Sure.
You know, and I think this is kind of like one of those slippery things like ethnic identity as well. Like when I think about Mexican Americans, there is many ways to be a Mexican American as there are Mexican Americans. And I think the same thing is true of being a Texas writer. And I think that to me, like the only two real things that I can put my thumb on or my finger on, it would be that you consider yourself to be a Texas writer, and at least one other person also considers you to be a Texas writer, and then I think you're okay. I mean, it's just really, really tough to define something like that. It has to do with personal identity, and I agree that it's something that you grow into. When I was 17, 18, wanted desperately to escape the Valley and escape Texas and go elsewhere, and make my way in the world and whatever. But I ended up staying here, and I'm glad I did. I'm better for it, I think.
So, when I was thinking about this panel and all of the different topics we could cover, setting, the people of Texas, I think, David, you alluded to this, the history and the sort of how the past and the present are constantly bumping up against each other. The future, Mike, you mentioned, misconceptions, stereotypes, a romanticizing that often excludes many of the people in Texas, or excludes the darkness that is also there in the history of the state. So much to talk about. So I mention all of those right now because I would encourage you, if I don't end up touching on one of them, or if you want to touch on one of them as you answer some of these questions, to feel free. But I wanted to start with setting. I visited Texas for the first time when I was 21, and I really just drove through the state from Florida to California. But as you know, that takes a long time, 800 plus miles. And the first thing that struck me, which is not at all original to me, of course, was that on I-10, across the state, the landscape just changes constantly. And you realize that it's not even, that the state is so big, it's that the state is just so wildly different. And so when we talk about setting in writing, I think the first thing we often think about is setting as a way to introduce a place, right? So for this, I wanted to invite, because you can't have a poet on your panel and not ask them to read a poem. So I did want to I asked David, and he was kind enough to say yes, to read one of his poems from his wonderful collection, They Call Me Güero, that really shows a lot of the natural landscape. Do you mind reading that, David? And then we'll jump into setting.
Yeah, not at all. And because setting is such an important part of that book, I think it makes a lot of sense. So this is narrated in Güero's voice. He's a 12-year-old boy living on the border. 60 miles wide on either side of the river, my people's home stretches from gulf to mountain pass. These borderlands, strip of frontier, home of hardy plants. The thorn forest with its black willows, Texas ebony, mesquite, huizache, and Brazil. Transplanted fields of corn and onion, sorghum and sugar cane. Foreign orchards of ruby red grapefruit, white with flowers. Native brush, rainbow bright with purple sage, rock rose, manzanilla, and hackberry fruit. Beyond its edges spreads the wild desert, harsh and lovely, like a barrel cactus in sunny bloom.
I really want to go there right now. I mean, I don't, because it's very hot, but.
And it's also replete with COVID-19 right now.
All sorts of reasons, but, so can we start with you, David, and can you talk about how imagery like that shapes your work, and how really writing about setting as an entry point to telling a story, or how setting influences the way you write about Texas?
Right. Well, I'm a big believer in anchoring authorial voice and community and geography in like region. I think that if you're going to be a regional author, if you're going to be a Texas author, and the flavor of the region of Texas you come from is going to, begin to seep into your work, then you need to like double down on it. And I think there's so much richness to be drawn from the setting that the characters live in. When I think about home, I can't not think about the natural things around me. When I think about this house that I'm in right now that my wife and I built 25 years ago, I can't help but think about the multiple mesquite trees and anaquita trees and hackberry, and the grass that no matter how hard we tried to bring in grass that's not native to this place, and eventually it was just too much work, and much easier just to let nature take over. the experience that you have as a child, spending time riding your bike, going into down here it's not the woods, but going into the brushland, and trying to avoid rattlesnakes, and trying to get opossums out of your car's engine when you leave the car there too long and they begin to settle in. Just all these little things about the flora and fauna, they shape who you are and how you see the world. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that. But I found that the more I tap into that, the more I like bring character almost as like setting almost as a character into my work, the more it resonates with readers, and the easier it is for me to wrap my head around the characters and why they are the way they are.
And when you think of, can you just elaborate a little more in terms of the Rio Grande Valley and what you think of really exemplifies the setting there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's important to understand about the valley is the river is the centerpiece of it, right? This is not actually a valley, for those of you who have never been down here. It was called the valley by white settlers that came in the early 1900s and were trying to find ways to draw other people down as they kind of enhanced agriculture down here and brought in irrigation techniques that allowed for the growing of citrus and so forth. But it's a coastal floodplain down at the very tip of it. Basically, Cameron County is all one huge floodplain. But in Hidalgo County, where I live, you have the river running through, and there are these oxbow lakes that were once like little meanders of the river that have been cut off. And all around them is this thorn forest. And of course, most of it's been cut down as people, went ahead and planted fields and built homes and stuff like that. But originally, when the Tampacua and other types of indigenous people from the Cuauhtecan branch of indigenous people in this area lived here, they were living in these thorn forests, which, the brushland ends and you get close to the river, and there's this thick kind of brambly quasi forest with trees that are not much bigger than, 2 or 3 meters tall, but that can be really dense. And the ocelots and northern mockingbirds and barn owls and other creatures that inhabit this zone, they inhabit on both sides of the river. So living here and thinking about the ecology of the area also helps you to understand a little bit better the human ecology and the fact that these are transnational communities. So when I was a kid and I would go from McAllen, where I grew up, to Reynosa across the border where we had family and stuff, it was, geographically, it was the same place. All the plants are the same. A lot of the buildings were the same. English and Spanish are spoken in both places. Obviously, more Spanish in Mexico than in the US. But all of that setting, from the actual flora and fauna down to the homes and the businesses and so forth, mirror each other on either side of the border. And that's one of the things that I think definitely informs my work, is this understanding that the river is like an axis, but it's not an axis. It's not a divide. It's an axis. It's, you have two things that are being balanced and they're equal, and there's this axis in the middle. And it's one of the reasons that when I think about the border and think about the way people outside of the borderlands think about the border, it sometimes can be really frustrating or maybe even enraging to me that people see it differently than the people who actually live here, and the people who have lived here for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I love that. And just the way that setting and describing, I mean, you did it so beautifully that I'm not even gonna try to do it myself, but that really on both sides of that river, you have the same geographical area, and that translates to the human sort of geology or geography that you can say so much with that, with the setting, with describing the landscape, that rather than having to say it in a different way.
I'll tell you a perfect example is my debut picture book is coming out next year from Penguin Random House, and the art is being done by Erika Mesa, who is a Mexican illustrator who lives in England now, but who's from Baja California. And her illustrations, when you're looking down at the two towns, because it's my two border towns, you're looking down at the towns, they look the same from an aerial view. And if you were just to rotate it around, like, you wouldn't know what side is the US, what side is Mexico, because in terms of geography and like architecture, they're so similar as to be indistinguishable.
I love it. So Mike, I wanted to talk to you about nonfiction and setting. And, you know, often you're writing about small towns in Texas. You're writing about sometimes dark stories, sometimes stories of redemption, sometimes stories about celebrities. But I've been lucky enough to see you talk about craft and how you use setting, and how setting really becomes a way to build a character and to tell your readers who that person you're writing about ultimately is before you even get to that person, right? By describing the place. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, if you could, and how you use setting when you have such a limited amount of space, right, in your pieces, how you use setting to the fullest in order to say so much.
And, you know, for nonfiction, it's in some ways like the least important thing. I mean, or it's important, but for a lot of writers, you don't have a whole lot of time. You don't have a whole lot of space. And so setting is often gets the short end of the stick. And so you don't write a whole lot about it. You write about what people say, and you write about what they do. But the really good stories are the ones where you dive into a place and show how the setting makes the people who they are. I mean, most journalism is about people. So what you're trying to do is show how the setting affects this person. And if you can do it right, you can bring this character out in this really compelling way. And I mean, and it takes some real digging. It takes some real observing, and it's really hard to do. But, you know, you spend time up in East Texas. You spend time up in like Tyler or Mineola or Van, these little towns where I've spent a lot of time doing stories. You see that part of the state, it really affects people. That part of the state is so different from, say, West Texas. It's like being in the South. I mean, Tyler, Texas is like Jackson, Mississippi. The homes have columns on them that even look like they're imitative. There are so many Baptist churches. There's a cultural conservatism there that mimics the South. You can't believe you're in Texas. You know, if you've had your mind that Texas is the cowboys and the cowboy hats and all, there's something about East Texas that is so different. It's the pine trees. It's the way that something about the darkness of the pine trees that feels like the darkness of the pine trees in Georgia or Mississippi or even Louisiana. And so the really compelling thing is to show how these places, which grew up around East Texas, grew up around slave holding economies, how a lot of that culture is imbued with everything they do, from the way they build their architecture to the way they separate their cemeteries racially, to the way the blacks and the whites don't go to the same churches, to the way people, the conservative policies of the place. And so you got to find a way to, you know, do that in a way that really makes your characters come alive, both sympathetically and not so sympathetically. Because it's very different from, say, Terlingua, Texas, where, you know, there's no pine trees, there's no Baptist churches. People aren't conservative politically there. They're anarchists. They're kooks. They're you know, bitter hippies. And so that terrain, the heat, and the people living in yurts and dugouts in the ground, that affects their character. That affects who they are. And so whatever story you do, if you can convey that in a way that the reader, if you do it right, it helps the reader go, oh, I get this. If you can convey, because people know what it means to talk about Mississippi and what Mississippi culture means, both good and bad. If you can bring that out in talking about somebody from Tyler, Texas, that is only going to make your character come alive more.
So, and we're going to circle back to you and talk more about character and with all of you in just a minute. But Mary Helen, there's so much that I could ask you about for setting, but what I want to know, what I'd love for you to talk about is, your wonderful novel, Migratory Animals. A lot of it is set in Austin. It's a group of friends who went to college together and then come back together sort of further down the road towards adulthood. And I would love to hear you talk about, when I think about writing about a city like Austin, that either your reader has their own ideas of what Austin is, or they have no idea what Austin is, how you take an almost larger than life, character like a city, whether it's Austin or Houston or Dallas or El Paso, but for your experience with Austin, how you wrote about that in a way that felt like you were doing it justice, but you weren't just writing a novel that described Austin, if that makes sense.
Well, and that's something actually I thought a lot about when I was when I had the Austin setting, and it turned out to be a lot more challenging than I thought, because it's so attractive to write about the quirky stuff that people automatically think about, the food trucks, the hipster mustaches, or even if you're thinking more historically, all the dope smoking hippies in the 70s. And so I really wanted to I have this, like I said, like you mentioned, I have this group of characters that have slightly different experiences and different kinds of backgrounds. And so I kind of wanted to use them to show the layers of Austin that are kind of beneath what, people who come for South by Southwest might see. There's this, we always talk about how they come for South by Southwest and we're like, I'm going to move here. This place is amazing. But they don't actually understand, the geographic segregation, the history of that in Austin. They don't understand gentrification and affordability and how that has totally transformed Austin and created its own kind of darker issues underneath the cool new beers and the great new taco trucks. And so that was something that I think in early drafts of my novel I actually had too much Austin in it because I just found myself wanting to add this layer and then, talk about the East Side, talk about this. And at some point, one of my friends who's a writer who was reading the draft was like, you got to cut down on the Austin stuff. It's like becoming a bigger character than your characters. But I think I kind of had to overwrite it in order to find the bits that I felt like actually, for me and for my characters, kind of told the story of Austin beneath the surface, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably, my guess would be that a lot of writers who are listening are potentially struggling with that in their own novel manuscripts, like how much is too much of your setting when you realize, especially if you do a lot of research on where you're setting your novel and you think, well, I have to include this, or it's important that people know that this as well. So what sort of, and just to follow up, what did you, was there anything in the novel that's, as you were writing it, that sort of surprised you about the way you feel about Austin, I guess? Like, did you discover anything about this setting when you were writing about it?
Yeah, I don't know if I was successful at making this come across, but one of the things that I hadn't really thought about until kind of getting a number of years into the writing this novel was the way layers of time work their way into settings. So these characters, when the novel begins, they're in their like mid to late 30s, but they initially had met in their early 20s at college in Austin. So many of them have kind of come back to Austin later. And so there's these kind of layers of time in a place. And I find that really fascinating. This idea of it not just being about the setting, the geographic setting, the details of a bar, but also the sense of what it means to have a home when things are changing so rapidly. A place is not the same as it was when you lived there before. Just like when you go back to your hometown, often it's, years later, it's the same, but it isn't the same. And so I think those kind of figuring out how to include those kind of timing, the kind of layering of time in that sense of the setting was something that was really interesting to me. And it kind of made me realize that almost all my characters were also trying to figure out what is home, where is home, what makes home home. It's not just obviously about having a really great, restaurant at the corner. And I think also these days, I think it's something even more difficult when you're especially looking at an urban setting, since we live in a time where most people don't die in the same place where they were born, right? So there's this constant kind of turnover in terms of the people that make up a setting as well. You know, it wasn't the same 50 years ago in terms of that, where there was more kind of stability in terms of that. So those are some things that kind of came up for me.
And that's a great segue into something I did want to ask each of you to touch on, if there's something that that interests you in this topic, and that is that it does seem like the history and the present are bumping up against each other a lot when you talk about writing about Texas, and that meaning that, you know, obviously there's a lot of tradition here, a lot of history that's very well known, a lot of iconic moments that people at least believe from what they've been taught in textbooks, they understand very well. And so for each of you in your own writing, and David, I'll start with you, where does history come into it? Where does the past come into it? And how do you think about that when you're writing about Texas?
Yeah, no, I think history is super important, and I'm always in all of my writing thinking about South Texas, Mexican Americans in South Texas, the roots of the Mexican American community in Mexico, and Mexico's roots in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. So I'm always like looking back and thinking about how these successive layers of time, to steal your phrase there, like build up this sort of texture that just you can't really get at it any other way than to layer that time in your writing as well. I think one of the one of the easiest ways to kind of explain the way I look at it is to talk about my book, Ghosts of the Rio Grande Valley. And so when the History Press asked me to write a book that kind of retold ghost stories from South Texas, I jumped at the opportunity and thought it would be a lot of fun. But the condition I gave them was, I want to retell these stories, but I want to set them in a historical context and talk about what the ghost stories illuminate about our collective past in the Rio Grande Valley. And so one of the things for each one of those ghost stories at haunted places throughout the 4-county area down here at the tip of Texas, I would dig into, how did the place come to be? How did that town come to be? What were the people like that lived there before there was a town? And what were the indigenous people that lived there before they did? And how do these things, how does the haunted nature of that place perhaps serve as like a scar on the collective psyche of the community? One of the things that I discovered was that a lot of the ghost stories, the more harrowing ones, came from the period of time in South Texas that's known as La Matanza, which is a period of about 2 years, 1915 through 1917, when about 100,000 federalized National Guardsmen and men with field commission to be Texas Rangers in South Texas, who hadn't been serving as Texas Rangers before, but who jumped at the chance to be able to do this, were basically policing the Mexican American community in South Texas because they were afraid of like a revolution. The revolution in Mexico had ended, but there were some people with the Plan de San Diego who wanted to create an uprising in the U.S. Southwest. And during that time, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 Mexican Americans were, lynched. Basically, there was summary justice carried out on the battlefield by these, mainly by Texas Rangers. And so a lot of the ghost stories, a lot of haunted places, come from that time period, and they're ways that the Mexican American community, having no other recourse, no like legal recourse, no system of justice that would back them up, no history books in which to tell these stories, kind of like passed down the tales of lynchings and other atrocities that had been perpetuated against people in the community by encoding them in ghost stories. One of the most famous ones is the haunting of the San Juan Hotel, where a Texas Ranger, who then went on to become a very important lawman in Far and Alamo and San Juan area, eventually like lived the final years of his life in that hotel, kind of abandoned by everybody. He had done so many horrible things that like his wife had left him, and his sons had abandoned him as well. And the story goes that he eventually died, and that his soul is trapped there. And the reason the hotel is so haunted and has to be shut down every time they try to reopen it, it's like every couple of years somebody else buys it, they try to reopen it and have to shut it down, is because the souls, the tormented souls of the people who were lynched and not buried properly and not given the kind of justice they deserved, are torturing his soul in that building because it's close to where a bunch of people were hanged in the San Juan City Park. And so that kind of thing to me is fascinating. That, you know, digging into the superficial, maybe even kind of silly or hokey stories of today, and finding these really incredibly moving roots behind them and historical depths to them. And when you kind of telescope that out, you suddenly imbue your silly ghost story with like this richness that nobody would have even imagined. And that was what I attempted to do with that book. And on a smaller scale, because that book is deliberately about doing that, but on a more subtle, more nuanced scale, I try to do that with other work where, you know, the characters are having interactions and there are tensions in a community or whatever, and these tensions are rooted in things that have happened for generations. I think it's really hard to write about Texas without thinking about the past, without thinking about this place as the the stolen homeland of indigenous people that was, you know, first taken by the Spanish, and then, you know, then occupied by Mexicans, and then by Tejanos and Texans, and by the South, the Confederate South, and the U.S. And like, it's hard to avoid thinking about those things if you want to tell like a really rich, nuanced story that's set in the state.
I love what Robin said in our chat box. Yes, what ghost stories illuminate about culture. Haunted places are haunted by things we don't want to talk about directly.
Yeah.
And I will mention, I had the pleasure of speaking to Monica Munoz, who wrote The Injustice Never Leaves You, the anti-Mexican violence in Texas, which is actually about directly that period of time.
Yeah.
And those thousands and thousands of lynchings.
It's a really powerful book.
Yeah. So Mike, what about you? Because you have been all over this state. And how do you think about the history of a place when you go in? Because you're writing for Texas Monthly. You're writing very current, or at least within the last, couple of decades, stories or follow-up to stories that happened maybe in the last couple of decades. But the history still informs, right? So what do you think about when you think about history and writing about Texas?
Well, a lot of my stories are criminal justice stories. And I do a lot of stories about people who are wrongly convicted. And they're usually wrongly convicted because of a mistake that somebody made. And often that mistake is something that was done in the past that was like the way we did it. For example, I'm working on a story now about a guy who was convicted. 6 different eyewitnesses said that he killed this guy in Houston back in 2010. And when he was convicted in 2012, well, I mean, pretty much, this is still around today, but it was definitely true before DNA came along. If 6 eyewitnesses said somebody killed somebody, that was it. You were toast. You go back and you look in the history of American jurisprudence. Eyewitness testimony was like the most fundamentally sound thing. But one thing we've learned from all the DNA exonerations over the last generation is that actually people make mistakes all the time. And they really make mistakes in the heat of a moment, when they're witnessing something terrible. And so we're finding now, just through the historical process, that we made a lot of mistakes, and now we have to fix it. And so this case I'm looking at now, it's a crime story, it's a legal story, but it's also a history story, because for generations, people who prosecuted crimes, judges who judged crimes, lawyers who defended people, the media, the movies, if you saw it with your eyes, that was good enough. And now we know that's just not true. And so some people are having a real hard time giving this idea up. So for example, in this case, where these 6 eyewitnesses said this guy did it, DNA has exonerated him. And yet still the eyewitnesses are like, I know what I saw. And so there's this tension. It's this historical thing. It's something, I mean, it's not just here in Texas, it's everywhere, but we're having to, recognize the mistakes we made and recognize how we need to change the system. And, in some ways, Texas has been the most progressive state of all, in not just the eyewitnesses, but in all kinds of reforms, which is totally fascinating to me, because Texas has this image as being this backwood, Peckerwood racist justice system. And in fact, actually, we've got one of the most progressive justice systems in the country. And you look at the history, yeah, there was Judge Roy Bean. Yes, there were terrible things done on the border. There were terrible things done in East Texas. It was unbelievably bad. But now all of a sudden the history is that Texas is in many ways leading the country in terms of criminal justice reform. So I love these cases because they're human cases. They're always one person having to deal with this. But you got to put it in the perspective of the history, and it makes it so much richer and such a better story if you do it right.
I'm just fascinated by what you just said. So can you just tell us one or two examples of how Texas is leading in criminal justice or reform?
We have a Forensic Science Commission, which is an unprecedented state commission. Nobody else had one. And with this Forensic Science Commission, it doesn't have the rule of law, but it is so respected. It's been around now for, 10, 12 years. It's so respected that if it holds hearings and makes a decision on something of forensic science that we now know is no longer sound, the legislators and the judges listen to it. And other states have followed along with that. We have changed the way we do eyewitness lineups. We have the Texas legislature, which is usually a bunch of buffoons and clowns, has gone out of its way to do things like set up rules on eyewitness lineups. So we can't do it the way we used to do it, where you could send the wrong person away. We do post-conviction DNA testing. We allow inmates to have post-conviction DNA testing. We've have done that for almost 20 years now. There are some states out there that still don't do that. We also have the most generous compensation package for somebody who is exonerated, who's spent 10 years in prison. We give them $80,000 a year. There are some states that don't give a dime. Mm-hmm. The people in Texas have gone out of their way. It's the legislators. It's I don't know what it is. I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. I have no idea why, and there are still plenty of retrograde, very reactionary forces in the state. But for the most part, Texas, and this has something to do with history, I don't know what it is, we are the most progressive state in the country when it comes to criminal justice.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to hear you talk about it a little more first, to get a sense of if you could think of what it is about the Texas character, I guess, that makes that so. But then also, I imagine there are writers listening who are writing books that, whether fiction or nonfiction, that have to do with criminal justice or the law, and I just think that it could be helpful for them to think about that there's some unique things about Texas that might inform whatever it is that they're writing in that front. Yeah. David says it's because we are a bunch of freaking outlaws. So, Mary Helen, I don't want to not give you a chance to talk about history and Texas, but yeah, you got something you want to add?
Well, I was just kind of thinking about something after what David was talking about with the ghost stories and these kind of different angles that we kind of get at social, political, different kinds of histories. And I was just making me think of, I think somebody earlier in the chat box mentioned Attica Locke's books, the Texas Ranger books that are set in East Texas, Bluebird, and I forget the one after that title, but
Heaven My Home.
Yes, thank you. And it made me think of how also there's other kinds of stylistic genres like the thriller that, people often think, oh, the thriller, it's just about getting a page turner and, having something really exciting happen. But I feel like the thriller actually gets at East Texas history and racism in a really interesting way by having that angle, that sense of, you know, the things that Mike was talking about in terms of the history of slavery there and how it still kind of echoes in segregation in East Texas. And you can really see that in her books. And I think by using the thriller format, it actually does more to bring that out than other kinds of genres might. So I think it's interesting the way contemporary writers are kind of approaching kind of historical, social and political kind of issues from these kind of unexpected angles, right? That kind of help to uncover some of those layers.
Attica Locke is a wonderful writer that I would recommend to anyone out there. But also the fact that she grew up in East Texas and she has so much love for that part of Texas as well, but she really writes about it in a way that is, I would imagine, very true to her experience as a Black woman in East Texas. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning her. So let's talk about, I could keep us all night, but I want to go into character. And I guess I would say that, you know, and I think each of you has maybe alluded to this a little bit, there are these stereotypes, there's the ability to write to a caricature almost of what people think of as a Texan. There's this idea of, you know, big hair, big hat, big steer. But obviously the state is much more diverse and interesting than that. So I would love for you to talk about, for each of you, how you approach character when you're writing about Texas and how you really bring out the more sort of nuanced side to someone you're writing about versus resorting to or slipping into any sort of caricature of characters who sometimes are really kind of unbelievable. Am I right? Mike Hall, I'm going to start with you because I'm thinking about a few of your stories.
It's so funny you say that, like big hair and cowboys, and these are the things that for the longest time Texas Monthly has used to sell its magazines. But we are totally at a crossroads these days. I mean, not just in the pandemic, but just in the fact that Texas is changing so much. So, you know, the kind of the mythical things that we used to do, the big hair, the cowboys, we don't do those things that much anymore. We are trying to find ways to be a sophisticated, modern, long form storytelling magazine in the current age. And it's not 1973 anymore, you know? So we are trying to write about characters that are not the same old characters, because yes, even though we still put Willie on the cover every chance we get because he sells, but he sells because he's a great artist, and at least so. But I mean, for me, I'm actually working on a story right now about Barry Corbin, the great actor who was, he was in Northern Exposure, he was in No Country for Old Men, he was in Urban Cowboy. He's from Lamesa, Texas, out in West, not that far from Abilene. And he's very much a West Texas character, very much a cowboy. He grew up riding horses and has this very thick West Texas accent that he still carries to this day. He's about to turn 80. And yet that's not what's so important to him. I'm finding, because I'm diving into his life and his movies, it's that he was a Shakespearean actor. He studied Shakespeare and acted in Shakespearean plays for 18 years. And the way those two come together is what's interesting about Barry Corbin. Yes, he used to be a cutting horse champion. Yes, he grew up around horses. Yes, he has this accent. Yes, he's played in probably 100 Westerns. That's not the key to trying to figure out who he is, which is my job as a journalist, as a profile writer. It's the fact that he loved Shakespeare and that he was doing Shakespeare with an accent from Lamesa, Texas. So I'm just spitballing here, but this is how I'm going to be working on this story, is trying to figure this out. How does that tell me something about this guy that maybe some other profiles of him haven't told?
Well, and in some ways, it's you almost benefit from this sort of larger than life expectation or assumptions that people make, because you have this ability to juxtapose right next to it something just completely different, like the Shakespearean
Oh, yeah.
acting, you know?
Yeah, we were sitting there, we were having the interview, and I was just talking with him about how he would deal with, I mean, he did Shakespeare all over the country, how he would deal with directors who would try to get him to tone down his West Texas accent. And he said, I just wouldn't do it. That's who I was. And then he went into the 7 Ages of Man speech, soliloquy from As You Like It. And he was stunning. It was amazing. It was like, oh my God, he's just not your typical, cutting horse West Texas actor.
Mary Helen, how do you think about character and sort of whether in your fiction or the nonfiction pieces that you've written, when you're thinking about sort of, representing truthfully Texans, but also perhaps playing off of sometimes those sort of stereotypes for love or expectations?
I mean, I guess for me, I've just never been interested in writing about the stereotype. Kind of like I mentioned what Mike's talking about, the character that's not your typical cutting horse, person. And I think maybe because of how I grew up, I was always kind of looking for the slightly off kilter, which to me is kind of the more realistic sense of Texas that I have. So like for me, kids, growing up in smaller towns in West Texas these days are more likely to be in a punk band or a heavy metal band than to know how to ride a horse really well. And so I'm always kind of looking for those angles that are a little bit surprising, and at least to outsider might be potentially surprising. I'm just personally tired of the kind of rehashing of the kind of ranching frontier kind of myths and so I'm always kind of looking for the thing that kind of spins that a little bit in an unexpected way. So for example, I set stories, they might be set on a ranch, but it's a ranch that's become a retirement community, right? Or it's like, there might be a neon Longhorn saloon, but it's like a tourist trap now. It's not filled with like the old men of the community anymore. Or, so trying to kind of look at some of these things that might still be around kind of from the past, but that are no longer being kind of fulfilling the same purposes that we would imagine in terms of the Texas stereotypes. There's like a great quote that I love from David Berman, he was the frontman for the Silver Jews, the band, and a poet. And he said, on one of his songs, he says, something about Dallas, how'd you turn a billion steers into buildings made of mirrors? And I think that's kind of what I'm interested in looking at when I'm writing about Texas and characters from Texas, is that kind of transformation. Like I'm in a punk band in West Texas, but yet I'm still kind of beholden to the fact that I'm supposed to be a cowboy, because of those expectations. So I think that's kind of the ground I try to tread when I'm thinking about Texas and character, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. David, what about you? Character?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this conversation is really great. And one of the takeaways that I think that Texas authors or aspiring authors should like drill down into is how similar the frustration of being a Texan or being a Texas author and having people from the outside viewing in see you through this lens that others you in a way that's frustrating and is inauthentic and so forth, because it's the same kind of othering or lens that happens to women when men are writing about women through the male gaze, or it happens to Mexican Americans or other Latinx people when they're being written about through the white gaze, or when Mexican Americans themselves are writing about themselves in order to appeal to that white gaze. And sometimes Texas authors write books in a way that's going to appeal to that outsider gaze as well. And when I'm writing about the border, and I don't write about other areas in Texas because I've never lived in them and I don't know anything about them and they don't speak to me in any particular way. But when I'm writing about the borderland, it is always on my mind that there's work to be done, as I mentioned earlier, to show people the great variety that exists within the border community, that fronterizos, that border folk are much different from what the stereotype is. You'll see Mexican American canon is relatively recent and still pretty sparse. But a lot of the early work that was being done was about struggles and about, being migrants and working in the North and then coming back to Texas and trying to lick your wounds from the things that you experience in the North. And I think that narrative, I won't say it's been played out because there's probably still great new takes on it. But one of the things that we've been working towards with things like dignidad literaria, literary dignity, social movements pushing back against publishing and some of its really bad practices, is to try to tell more stories. They call me Güero, which has won like a ton of freaking awards. One of the things that I set out to do with that book is to tell the story of a Mexican-American boy in South Texas that would be unrecognizable to anybody who's not from South Texas. That people would read it and they would go, wait a minute, that's what it means to be a Mexican-American in South Texas? I deliberately made him light-skinned, red hair and freckles, and there are tons of kids like that down near the valley. I made him a gamer, a Gen Z kid who likes to write poetry and things like that. So I wanted to blow up the stereotype, and I seek to do that in a lot of my work. My Goddess of Twins series, for example, features parents, a mother and father, who are both bisexual. One of them's a professor, one of them's a sculptor. Their children are middle-class Mexican Americans who discover they're shapeshifters. That's always a twist. But
that's always happening.
Yeah, all the time. In South Texas, children are always being born and just shifting into like ocelots, and you're like, God damn it. Another shapeshifter in the family. Wow. But yeah, to me, like there's a deliberate attempt to blow up the stereotype, because I blew up the stereotype, and all of my primos and primas and tios and tia, like everybody I know, their identity runs contrary to the stereotype. The stereotype has like no validity, but the stereotype is used, frankly, politically against my community, against this transnational community down here in the borderland. And so I see it as like necessary work. Greater representation of border folk needs to find its way into the stacks and into people's reading lists. And one of the best ways to do that is to create really powerful portraits of characters who are unique individuals who are also within a community that they see themselves a part of. And that tension between individuality and communal identity is something that is super important to me. And like I said at the very beginning, arguably one of the traits about Texas that I think is kind of universal across all the regions.
Alex says, most of the non-Texans I meet are really surprised when I tell them about the shapeshifters. So
they're like, how did that not make the national news?
And I'm so glad you brought up Dignidad Literaria, because it's something that I actually wanted to ask you to talk about a little bit. And I guess, could you just mention a little bit more about the mission, and then also if there is a way for folks who are listening to support the work that you're doing, we'd love to know that as well.
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of sum things up really quickly, when my friend Miriam Gurba, who is a great Chicana author from California, wrote a negative review that she'd been contracted to by a magazine of American Dirt, a book which had been positioned by Macmillan and its imprint Flatiron as like the book in 2020 about the immigrant experience, about the undocumented experience from Mexico, written by a woman who's not Mexican or Mexican American. The magazine went ahead and paid her a kill fee. They were like, no, we're not publishing this. She wouldn't like back off and give them a slightly rosier review because she felt it was trash. And so then it was eventually published elsewhere, and it began to like garner a lot of attention, a lot of controversy, because Macmillan had invested millions of dollars into making this the book. And publishing has got this problem that they do that, every quarter or every year, there's like that one book, and they invest all their PR money. They pay a massive, 6-7 figure advance to the author, and just, they do this to the detriment of literary dignity for communities that have been historically shut out of publishing. And so that, created this huge backlash. I began to support her. I got my hands on an advanced review copy of the book. My friend in Austin let me read it. And then I wrote a review. And eventually what began to happen is there was so much support, but also so much hate against us and backlash that we began to organize ourselves with the help of a group called presente.org. And that's just the word like present with an E at the end, .org, presente.org. They're the folks that got like Lou Dobbs pulled from CNN and stuff like that. And we wrote to Macmillan, Roberto Lovato, Miriam, and I, and said, hey, you know, we would like to pivot away from our attacks against American dirt and have a conversation with you guys about what can be done to improve Latinx representation in publishing, because right now it's abysmal. You know, like about 1% of authors published every year are Latinx when we make up 18% of the US population. And so they were down for it. And we went out on February 3rd, we sat down in their offices and they told us, we're not going to make any decisions today. We just want to meet with you, get some feedback, and, you know, and we'll take it into consideration. And we told them, we have a press conference scheduled for 2 hours from now. We're not leaving this office without some substantial commitment on your part to do something significant. And by the end of those 2 hours, we had wrangled from them 3 important points: that they agreed that Latinx representation, both in the titles they acquired and in the editors that they had on staff, was inadequate, and they were going to fix that. They agreed to give us a report in 30 days on their initial steps towards doing that. And at the end of 90 days from our initial meeting, they would have like a full initiative in place. And they carried through. I mean, we had to ride their asses the whole way, but they carried through. And it's like been a transformative thing at Macmillan, where John Sargent, the CEO, has stepped away from the creative decisions because he was basically forced out. We also began to work hand in hand with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and Joaquin Castro and other people to try to like bring pressure to bear from multiple points on this big publisher. And that's what's going on. We are now like, you know, just continuing to take that fight to the other publishing houses, even the ones that we're published with. We're like, hey, we need to have these conversations. I know maybe I'm putting my head on the chopping block, but I would rather be a martyr for a cause that I believe in than, you know, get a bigger book deal out of it or whatever. So if people want to support us, they can go to, and I'll put it in the chat, they can go to presente.org, the kind of like umbrella organization that supports legally and financially the efforts of the 3 of us. And they can also follow the hashtag that I'll add in the chat as well. And, there are lots of like meetings that happen in different cities around the country, and where people come together and have conversations about literary dignity, because literary dignity is something that all groups, all minoritized, marginalized groups in the United States should have access to.
Yeah, no, it's pretty special and amazing what you guys started, and then to see how Macmillan, I mean, I worked at Macmillan, it was my first job in publishing, and to see that announcement about how they're changing their leadership, and it's pretty cool to see that that a grassroots effort made that happen. So,
by authors, authors,
it's the power.
Yeah.
So I want to not keep you guys all night long, but I do want to bring up the books that each of you were kind enough to recommend, some books that you would suggest as books that are a great way to sort of get to know Texas, or in some way represent one part or more than that, multiple parts of Texas. The one thing I wanted to say before that I feel when I think about Texas is how lucky I feel to be in a state where where writers and storytellers are, you know, revered. I mean, I hope you guys feel that. And to be in a state where we have the Texas Institute of Letters, where we have one of the largest book festivals in the country, where we have so many multiple book awards, many of them, all of you have won, where we have the magazine Texas Monthly that really not only is a regional magazine, but is a nationally, you know, recognized and read magazine that does such an amazing job of writing about the state. So I think that's pretty special. And coming from the publishing industry in New York to Austin, I immediately felt the difference in terms of the support of writers for other writers, and Yeah, I just wanted to say that because I hope that folks who are listening recognize that part of being a Texas writer for sure, that there's a real community here and a real love for storytelling and writers. So that's my spiel on that. If anyone wants to add anything, feel free, but otherwise I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. So I'm just going to pull up a few slides, guys. Indulge me. For a minute. That's my desktop. It's nutty. Okay. David, you're up first.
And I'll be brief because I just talked a lot. So yes, I mentioned this title at the very beginning of Rolando Hinojosa Smith, who is a Valleyite as well, or was before he passed away. This was his first book, The Valley, Estampas del Valle. I think it was originally published just in Spanish, and then later he did a translation. It is the book that kind of launches his Faulkner-esque kind of alternate South Texas, where Belkin County and Clay City and these other pretty well known now in Texas letters fictional places in South Texas. And it is, as I said, a series of vignettes, usually narrated in a first person in this just really very authentic, jocular kind of way by a variety of people living in the borderlands and living in the Rio Grande Valley in the early to mid 20th century. And by the end of it, you see how all this tangled web of lives comes together, and it's just this really, really amazing piece of work that, and this is the cover is from the recent republication that Arte Público Press out of Houston did, and they've been putting out all of his books as well. So definitely something you guys should check out. And it's been influential, I think, on a lot of writers, and a modern writer whose work kind of aligns with his to some extent as well, Lupe Garcia McCall, who writes a lot of books set on the border, set in the past and in the present.
Thank you. And then, of course, I wanted to, you did not ask me to do this, David, I did it, include just a couple of your books here. I'll mention for everyone that there is a special store on bookshop.org that benefits Bookwoman that lists all of the books we're going to mention tonight. So I will send you a link afterwards, and I would encourage you to buy some of the recommendations, but also to support our wonderful presenters and pick up their books as well. Michael, you're up. You're muted.
I picked The Gay Place just because that was the first book that really gave me a sense of place of Texas. It's the legendary book by Billy Lee Bramer basically about Lyndon Johnson and about Austin in the 50s. And you get a real sense of what Austin was like back then and what things were like before the modern age. But what I really love, the first 4 paragraphs of the book are just this amazing description of the area, the terrain around Austin, the hill country. And then he starts wide and then comes in, and with his main character sleeping off a drunk in a car as these kids wake him up near the Capitol. And it's beautiful. It's one of the great, I mean, most people consider it the great Texas novel. I don't know about that, but it's got moments in it that are as great as his hero, F. Scott Fitzgerald. So I highly recommend that.
I love it. And then, of course, I would encourage everybody out there to subscribe to Texas Monthly. It's a great magazine. There's amazing stories in it. You'll find a lot of them written by this guy, but also a lot of other really wonderful writers. Now, if you've ever played a board game with Mary Helen, you know that she is very competitive. So she has recommended a lot of books to us, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to maybe breeze through what might be of interest about these titles.
I feel like if you were to go and read all of these books and you didn't know that they were all written about the same state. You wouldn't figure that out. Does that make sense? Like, I really feel like this list for me is like a really big kind of breadth in terms of lot is about Houston. And one of the things, it's a contemporary book. And one of the things I loved about it is I actually lived in Houston for a number of years in college and just after. And the Houston that Brian Washington brings to life is like in a totally different Houston than I ever knew. And that's one of the things I found so kind of brilliant about the book. Obviously, some of these you can just see right what you'll learn about: Brownsville, Corpus Christi. I'll mention quickly, Love Me Back is also a book that it's really dark and noir and set in Dallas. And it's a lot about kind of money and steakhouses and sex. And again, almost the polar opposite of what you would expect when somebody says a Texas novel to be like. And yet it's really getting at a really kind of important kind of underbelly of urban Texas. All right, so I won't keep us here.
Well, and I'll say, and someone mentioned it in the chat, Valentine is a more recent novel, just a few months ago, right? Elizabeth Wetmore. And I've read this one set in Odessa, and just really, it's a great book. It's a page turner, it's a thriller, but it's also just a really interesting look at Odessa, the history there, the present day there, and I can't recommend it enough. And then, of course,
things they're talking about twisting that idea of stereotypes, because it's about oil, but it's all told from women's perspectives. It's not the classic perspective you get about the oil fields in her book.
Yeah. And then, of course, Mary Helen's wonderful novel, Migratory Animals. Somebody is asking, Mike just mentioned the idea of the Great Texas Novel. Which novel do our panelists think are in the running for that title? So we've given a lot of examples of books tonight, and we've talked about a lot of different authors and titles. Does anyone have a book they want to throw out and suggest as the Great Texas Novel?
I mean, I would definitely say that The Gay Place is the old interpretation of that, but it's at this point it's so old, and there have been so many that have been written since then. It really needs to be re-upped.
Yeah, for me, I just have a hard time even venturing anything, because it seems to, as soon as you say one book, certainly it's not going to be about all of Texas, and so then it kind of solidifies this idea that Texas is west or Texas is east, or so I don't know. I don't know if I think I'm just gonna
I would say maybe North to Yesterday by Robert Flynn.
North?
Yeah, I read that. I need to read that.
Yeah.
Yesterday?
North to Yesterday by Robert Flynn. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. I put the name, but
and Bob is just, he's still around. He's as old as the dinosaurs. We pick on him all the time. But he is like one of our greatest voices and one of our greatest writers, maybe a little underappreciated, but I just totally recommend. If somebody like forced me, like what's happening right now, to pick like the Texas writer, I would say Bob Flynn.
All right.
No hesitation.
You heard it here first.
And he's probably, if he finds out, he'll be like, what do you want? What are you buttering me up for?
Well, he's going to find out. This is going viral. So I did want to mention again, and we'll send this link to everybody, but we do have a special store that benefits Bookwoman. It's one of Austin's really just treasured indie bookstores, feminist bookstore. But you can buy your books anywhere you'd like to buy them. I will always suggest you support an indie bookstore, and that remember, the best way to support writers is to buy their books or follow them on Twitter or go to their websites or subscribe to their magazines. So if anyone has any questions they want to throw in the chat box, I haven't seen any, but you're welcome to throw them in. And if not, I want to just say a really big thank you to each of you for being here. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who has been listening, whether on YouTube or on Zoom. This has been a great conversation, and there's so much more to talk about. We do this talk probably once a year because it's always different depending on whose perspective you get. But I think we've all just I don't know. I've learned a lot. So thanks, guys. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for putting it together, Becca.
Yeah, thank
You're
you.
welcome. Bye, guys.